My Friend Flicka by Mary O'Hara. Chapter 23. Ken found a nicer place for the filly. A fence ran from the corrals of the cow barn straight north, dividing the calf pasture from the practice field. A path led along this fence, and about 300 yards from the corrals reached a spot where several cottonwood trees made a wall of foliage. Under the boughs of the trees, the path sloped sharply down for 10 feet or so to a flat area of beautiful green turf, through which Lone Tree Creek ran. When the creek was in flood, all this flat part was covered, but now, in summer, it was dry, and the grass such a vivid green that, coming up it from the drier land round about, it was startling to the eye. Golden sunlight lay upon part of it. Part of it was dark and pleasant with the shade of the cottonwood trees that hung over the hill and sent their roots winding down its face to bore underground for water. Here, without having to hunt for it, Flicka had rich grass to eat and running water to drink. There was both sun and shade. Ken called the place Flicka's nursery, and each morning and evening he walked down the little path carrying a can of oats to empty into the wooden feed box which he had set near the roots of the cottonwoods. Standing as tall as she could at the foot of the bank, Flicka could just see over the top of it and catch sight of Ken coming. He could see her too. It made him tingle all over. The first time he saw her head, just the pretty face, with the blonde bang over her forehead, and the dainty pricked ears framed in the down-hanging branches of the cottonwoods, and realized that she was looking for him, and waiting for him. Ken bragged about it that night at supper, but Howard said, "Nuts! She's looking for her oats, not for you." McLaughlin answered sharply, "Oats, or the bringer of oats, in the long run, it gets to be the same thing." And Nell added dryly, "Are human beings any different?" No doubt about it, Flicka did love her oats. As Ken stooped over to empty the can into the feed box, she would be close beside him, reaching her nose in. But when he put out his hand to stroke her, she pulled back. She would not let him touch her. Ken still had work to do, work in the corrals when the brood mares were brought in with their colts and the colts were branded. Work on the fences when Tim was sent out with the small Ford service truck full of fence posts that had been cut the summer before, dried and dipped in an asphalt mixture to protect them against ground rot. Work on the ditches and the meadows, which must be given every possible chance to grow hay in these last weeks before the cutting. Now that the rodeo horses had been taken to town, the two boys were riding Cigarette and Highboy again, and every few days must ride the boundaries of the ranch to spot any breaks in the fence, any strange animals that had got in, any gates open that should be shut. Fishermen came in from the highway, opened the gates to drive their cars through so they could go down to the stream to fish, and sometimes drove out again without closing the gates. One day, Ken and Howard found 100 head of yearling steers that had got in on the McLaughlin land and were gorging on the meadow and trampling the grass. The boys galloped home to give the alarm. McLaughlin and his men rode out, drove the steers off, and then McLaughlin, in a rage, wired up the gates and planted posts across so that they couldn't be opened again. There was also the daily work of halter breaking and training the 4 little spring colts. McLaughlin had taught Howard and Ken just how to do it, and for the first day or two he helped them himself. First, the colt must be penned. The little one came running beside its dam, and the mare came for oats. Once in the small pen, the colt, not much frightened because it was standing by its mother, was held forcibly and the halter put on. and a long lead rope slipped into the halter ring. Now the colt was hauled away from its dam out into the larger corral to the hitching post. The rope was looped several times around the post. One of the boys was given the end to hold and placed himself behind the post, so that the colt thought he was being held by the boy, not by the post. Invariably, the colt pulled and fought against the rope. He shook his head from side to side. He braced all 4 feet out straight and stiff. Even grown horses did this, sometimes sitting down like big dogs. Occasionally, this pulling and fighting went on for a long time, but as a rule, with a young colt, it was soon over. The sudden surrender was almost always expressed in the same manner. The colt would rear straight up, paw the air a moment, then plunge forward to release the pull on his head. That plunge was a movement towards the master, a capitulation, and the colt never forgot it. At the moment of the plunge, when he approached most closely the one who was coercing him, there came the sudden physical easement of strain, a good feeling. If he stood there, trembling, close to his master, there was the comforting voice, the hand patting his head, and he began to feel safe. Sometimes there were tugs of war again, but never so long nor so determined. And in a day or two the habit was formed. At the slightest pull on the halter rope, the colt would follow. From this point on, Howard and Ken needed no further assistance. The colts became as familiar with the boys as they were with their dams. They would sniff and nip at them, rear up and play, striking at them with their little 4 feet. The last week or so, all Ken and Howard had been doing with their colts was to lead them by the halter around the pasture, saying "Whoa" now and then, at the same time halting the colt, and making them go at different speeds, from a slow walk up to a brisk trot. When they had walked them enough, they took them back into the pens, removed the lead ropes and played with them, patted and whacked them, waved blankets around them, leaned on their backs, fed them oats out of their hands. Right over the fence from the calf pasture, where the boys worked with their colts, was the practice field, and here, for many hours a day, Ken's mother and father and the bronco buster worked with the 4 polo ponies, Rumba, Blazers, Don, and Gangway. At last the day came when the work was done. The 4 ponies were loaded into the truck, and McLaughlin drove them to the station to be shipped with Sergeant's bunch. Then the little bronco buster left. They all gathered around his battered sedan, packed full of saddles and equipment, and said goodbye to him and wished him luck at the rodeo. "Don't take chances," Nell McLaughlin said, "but I notice you're pretty careful." Ross's steady blue eyes looked at her in his direct and respectful manner, and he answered, "A man that monkeys around wild horses don't kid himself any, missus. It don't do no good." Then he grinned. "I may be in hospital again after the rodeo, but if I ain't, I'll be back to see how Ken makes out with his filly." He grinned at Ken, and Ken grinned back. Then he took off his sombrero, shook hands all round, climbed into the driver's seat, and rattled off. And the next thing that happened was the rodeo. Ken was entirely alone on the ranch that day with Flicka, when suddenly she couldn't get up from the ground. It was the last day of the rodeo. The Studebaker had gone into Cheyenne on each of the 4 days of the big show, Frontier Days, called by the Cheyenne boosters, the daddy of 'em all. Ken went the first day and saw Lady and Calico and Buck and Baldy in the parade, ridden by 4 of the city fathers, all dressed up in 10-gallon hats and fringed chaps. He saw the famous bucking horse, Midnight, throw every rider that mounted him. But Ken didn't go in again, not even on this last day, when there was going to be the wild horse race, and it annoyed his father. But McLachlan said it was up to him. If he'd rather be alone on the ranch than at the rodeo with his family, why, he could suit himself. But one thing was certain. No one was going to stay with him, not Gus or Tim either, because they'd both been promised the day off. Gus would be back on the 4 o'clock bus to milk the cows, and until then, Ken would be alone. Ken said he didn't mind. He'd have Flicka. Ken stood by the car to see them off, and, the last thing, his father stuck his head out the window and called to him. "All right, kid, leaving you in charge. It's all yours." And the Studebaker, carrying his mother and father and Howard and Gus and Tim, slid down the hill, rattled over the cattle guard, and bowled smoothly down the road. Ken stood there, watching it until it disappeared. How different everything was now that they had gone. All yours. He felt the responsibility his father had laid upon him. He was in charge. The two dogs, Kim, the collie who looked like a coyote, and Chaps, the black spaniel, were standing beside him. They, too, were watching the empty road. They were used to doing that, and they knew the difference. The road with the Studebaker on it, going or coming, the road empty, and silence all around. Ken went up to his room and stood before his bookshelf. He picked out the Jungle Book, then ran downstairs and out, across the green, into the calf pasture, and down the path by the fence to Flicka's nursery. She was drinking at the brook when he came. He greeted her with a stream of talk. He visited with her a while, standing as close to her as she would let him. Then he seated himself on the bank of the hill under the cottonwoods and began to read. Flicka wandered around her nursery. Sometimes she wanted sunshine, and stood under the dappled golden light until she was warmed through, then took a few steps into the shade of the trees. Ken, glancing up, saw her standing quite near, watching him. He began to read aloud to her, and her eyes came forward sharply, as if she was listening. He read her the part that told about Ran, the kite, seeing Mowgli, the wolf boy, carried through the treetops by the flock of monkeys, and about Mowgli remembering the master word of the jungle that Baloo, the brown bear who was his tutor, had taught him, and crying to Ran, the kite, "We be of one blood, ye and I. Mark my trail. Carry word to Baloo of the Seeonee wolf pack, and Bagheera of the Council Rock. Mark my trail." Flicka's head turned. As Ken's voice went on, she moved over to the empty feed box, sniffed it, put out a long pink tongue, and licked up a few stray grains left over from her breakfast. Then she stood quietly, broadside to Ken, switching her cream-coloured tail to keep off the flies. Now and then Ken stopped reading, put his book down, and lay back on the hill with his arms under his head. Looking up through the branches of the trees, he could see a patch of blue sky with a little vague half-moon floating in it, the daytime moon, called the children's moon, because it is the only moon most children ever see. At first he thought it was a little soft cloud. It was another hot day, but down here it was pleasant and shady. There wasn't a sound, except for the ripple of the stream where it ran over stones and shallow sandy places. Now and then the splash of a trout that flipped out and in again, and all the time a faint hum, the buzzing of the racing flies that were always in the out of doors. It was a sound that went with summer, part of the silence. Ken and Flicka were all alone in the calf pasture. The 4 colts that the boys had trained, and their dams, had been taken out to Banner on the saddleback, because the job was done, and well done. McLachlan had said the colts were perfectly halter broken. It had taken about a month. Flicka went down to the stream to drink, and Ken's eye followed her. Flicka, of course, had never been halter-broken. It was a most important part of a colt's training and should be done as early as possible because it was the beginning of everything. But Flicka was a year and several months old, and she wouldn't even let him touch her. As for flirting blankets around her, or putting a rope on her, the very thought of such a thing made shivers run down his spine. He could imagine her fighting the rope, behaving as she had behaved up there in the corral and the stable, behaving like Rocket, Loco. At this thought, Ken drew up his knees, clasped his arms around them, and put his head down on his arms, hugging himself against the dread. He didn't know yet if she was or wasn't. He couldn't know until he began the halter breaking. He felt sickening tremors inside. Just a little while ago, he had found courage, somehow, to face the possibility of Flicka's being Loco. But now his courage was gone, or at least, he could not easily find it. The hope and sweetness of the weeks of caring for her and the little filly's tentative response to him had pushed the dread out of the foreground of his thoughts, had almost pushed it into one of those airtight compartments of his mind. But the doors did not close as tightly as they had before. The boy knew what was behind them. Having faced the horror once and righted himself after the shock, he would be able to do it again. A vague sense of this came to Ken before he lifted his head from his knees, and it gave him strength to look forward to that day. And it was a day that was coming soon, when Flicka would have to be halter-broken. Then he deliberately shoved away all these unpleasant thoughts, shut the door on them, and gave himself up to the rapture of contemplating his filly. The little animal was disclosing to him an odd, fascinating personality, whimsical, remote, temperamental. She moved a step or two at a time across the turf. In the sun, her glossy hide shone like gold, the long cream tail swinging to one side or the other. Now and then she stopped and stood motionless, her attention caught by some far sound or movement that Ken could not hear or see at all. And her statue-like pose, the graceful turn of her neck, the delicate, pointed ears, and every line of her body, instinct with life and intelligence, exerted on Ken the fascination that horses have always exerted upon human beings. He had fallen under her spell, a classic spell. If she could only really make friends with him, he had done his best to win her confidence. He had done all that his father had told him to do. Surely she knew he loved her, and he was there just to serve her and care for her, and still, when he came near, there was that alert turn of her head, the wary look in her eye, and the quick step away. Still, when the colts galloping on the upland were near enough to be heard, she turned to them, and yearned to them, and whinnied in longing. If she had 4 good legs and her freedom, thought Ken, he'd never see her again. She'd be just a stream of power and speed, golden pink, whipping over the range. He sighed. Well, it was time to eat. He must go up to the house and get his lunch. Flicka was still standing up when he left. When he came back, running down the path with the dogs at his heels, his eyes were fastened on the spot just over the brow of the hill where he so often saw Flicka's face watching for him. But it wasn't there. He ran down the hill and saw that she was flat on her side. As she heard him coming, she made an effort to get up and fell back again. It stopped Ken dead in his tracks. Then he ran to her and fell on his knees beside her. "Oh, Flicka," he cried. "What is the matter? Flicka, what's happened to you?" She was dying. She had been dying all along. Or something had happened while he was away at lunch. Perhaps she'd fallen and hurt herself again. Perhaps her back was broken. Hardly knowing what he was doing, he patted her face and kissed it. He went behind her, crouched down, put his arms around her head, and held it. Flicka made another effort to get up. Lying on the left side, when a horse wants to get up, it rolls over on its belly, straightens the forelegs, pushes against them and against the right hind leg, and so gains its feet. The only leg that is not used in the process is the left hind leg upon which the horse is lying. About to make the effort, lying on her belly with her legs gathered and her head up, Flicka neighed, ending in a few little grunts. And Ken had to smile because he understood just what she was saying. It was not exactly the neigh of nervous impatience of which his father had spoken, but it was a neigh of determination. And the grunts added on were from nervousness. She was going to do it, but wasn't quite sure that she could. Ken stood back to give her the chance. She started to scramble, then collapsed suddenly and dropped her head again. "Oh, Flicka, Flicka!" he cried, almost certain now that something must be wrong with her back, and again he fell on his knees and took her head in his arms. She heaved a deep sigh and half closed her eyes, completely relaxed, while Ken's little brown hands went all over her head and neck, smoothing the silken softness of her skin, patting the sensitive curves of her face, straightening her forelock. She let him. Was it only because she couldn't help herself? Or was it perhaps what his father had said, that now, in her greater trouble and helplessness, the last shred of her fear had gone and she really wanted him and loved him? Whatever it was, it released all the boy's tenderness and longing. He pressed his hands upon her, he laid his head down on hers, and his breath was troubled. At last he went back to the bank of the hill and sat down, wishing that the afternoon would hurry up and that Gus would come. The bus would drop him at 4 o'clock out on the highway. It would take him half an hour to walk to the house, change into his blue jeans. He'd be all dressed up in a tight shiny blue serge suit with a 10-gallon hat and fine shoes, and be ready to milk the cows. Ken was to bring the cows in and have them waiting in the corral, and he was to measure out the cow feed and put it in the feed boxes for the cows, so Gus would have nothing to do but drive them in and milk them. Flicka seemed to have gone to sleep. Presently, Ken lay down on the hillside and fell asleep too. A sound came into his sleep, a loud, distressed crying. It got louder and then was a terrible, anguished bellowing, and Ken was sitting up straight, wide awake and tense with fear. It wasn't anything to do with Flicka, but she, too, was holding her head up from the ground, listening. It was a cow bellowing. The sound came from the east, beyond the calf pasture. That was Crosby's land. It wasn't one of the goose bar cows then. Ken was frightened and sickened by the sound. Something awful must have been happening. What? Ought he go and find out? You're in charge. Maybe the mountain lion. His thoughts jumped to the Winchester. Where was it? In the back of the Studebaker? No. The officers had been shooting with it, and afterwards his father had put all the guns back in the gun rack in the dining room. Yes, he could get it. Could go to see what was the matter. The boy got slowly to his feet. Should he get the Winchester first, or go to the cow first? Would he be able to use the Winchester? It was heavy. Perhaps better to get his own little .22. Perhaps go first and see what was the matter. Indecision paralyzed him. Then suddenly he came to life, turned and ran eastward. He flew along the edge of the brook, crossed and recrossed wherever the footing was best. Some places the willows crowded down thick to the edge of the stream, and he had to go around. The bellowing continued. Well, anyway, If it was the wildcat, it hadn't got her. She was making plenty of noise. Maybe it had got her calf. Ken ran fast so he wouldn't be frightened. He saw the red hide of a Hereford cow, not one of their own Guernseys. She was standing on the edge of the creek where a barbed wire fence crossed it. As Ken rolled under the fence and went around to her, he couldn't see that anything was the matter. Then he saw, and it made him sick. The bottom strand of the wire fence was broken. Some other old wires were tangled with it, and the whole web of wire was wrapped around the cow's udder. She had tried to tear away. One teat was hanging almost off. Blood was pouring out of it. The harder she pulled, the deeper the barbed wire embedded itself. Ken put his hand to the hind pocket of his overalls. He had been told by his father, "Never let me catch you out without a pair of wire cutters in your pants pocket." But the cutters weren't there. He remembered clean blue jeans this morning, and the cutters lying on the table in his room. He headed for the cow barn. There would be cutters there. While he ran, he was wishing that Gus would come. He wondered if he should wait for Gus to cut the cow loose. It's all yours. No, he'd do it himself. It took him 15 minutes to get back to the cow with the cutters. Then he had been running so hard, he had to kneel beside her for a few minutes until his breath came easily and his hands were steady enough to begin work. The cow, frantic with pain, tried to butt him. Again and again she plunged to tear loose. Ken talked to her and tried to calm her while his small hands, not too expert with tools, struggled with the cutters, clipping the wire here, there, and again, drawing out short pieces, pulling the barbs out of her bleeding flesh, until at last she was free. He had been wondering what he should do with her. That one teat and some of the long cuts should be sewn up. Perhaps Gus would do it, if he could get her into their own cow barn. But the cow saved him the trouble of deciding. When she found herself free, she started off at a gallop, blood and milk together dripping from the wounds. She was heading for her home barn. Ken walked slowly back through the calf pasture to Flicka. She was still lying as he had left her. Horror and loneliness settled down on the boy. He went hunting for the cows, found them in section 16, and drove them all in and shut them in the corral outside the milking barn. He measured their feed and put it in the boxes. Then he went out to the roadside, sat down on a rock, and fastened his eyes on the place, half a mile away, where Gus would first appear when he came walking in from the highway. Ken could hear the sound of the transcontinental traffic, a horn tooting, a car changing gears. The lights changed, the shadows fell lengthwise on the grass. He had the feeling of going off into a daydream.